think it's important for people to understand that attacking the energy system in Ukraine is a key part of Russia's war effort. It's not like an accidental thing that, oops, we, blew up a power plant. The Russians are deliberately targeting this stuff to undermine the Ukrainian economy, to make life very difficult for individual people, to literally leave people in the dark and in the cold and demoralize them. So this is part of a war effort. This is generally considered, as I understand it, maybe we need to look at this more closely. I understand this to be come under the definition of a war crime because you're blowing up civilian infrastructure that has no real military purpose.
Today, our guest is Paul Hennemeyer, an American energy executive based in Europe with over 30 years' experience in the energy industry. He and his partner Ralph Meimer created Re-Energize Ukraine, a volunteer initiative to help supply spare and retired electricity equipment to Ukraine.
Okay, here we are talking Ukraine in English. This is episode number 10. And I'm very excited to have our guest for our 10th episode, Mr. Paul Hennemeyer. Paul's an American who has some roots in Germany and currently lives in Germany. He's got a professional, long-standing career working in the alternative energy sphere industry as an energy executive. I guess primarily in Europe. Maybe you can expound a little on some of your background here. That's sort of like the, very vague general title
Sure.
I'm giving you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Damien. Thanks for the opportunity to talk on the podcast and talk about Ukraine and the energy system there. But yeah, as you noted, I've been in the energy space for a long time. Coming up to like 30 years now. Worked in a bunch of different markets, actually, mostly in Europe, but also worked in India, South America, also for some years. I would say in the very brief version, I initially did a lot of consulting work with governments, mostly some companies, but governments who were looking to redesign their power sector, their electricity sectors, and make them more competitive and open them up a bit. So did a lot of project work along those lines. And then I spent a lot of time as a project developer. So basically, this is all the work that's done before a project, an energy project of any type, begins to be constructed. So it's the idea, the market analysis, coming up with the business plan, finding sites, getting sites permitted, getting connections to the electricity system, the fuel supply, the equipment, who's going to buy the power, so the commercial arrangements, and ultimately who's going to finance it as well. So that's usually a multi-year process that's done before a project goes into construction. When it goes into construction, it's somebody else's problem, typically, at least from my perspective. Did that for a number of years, initially with thermal power plants, gas-fired power plants, and then much more focused on renewables over the last 15 years. And then more recently, I've just been focused on the kind of financing side of it. So I worked for the financing arm of both Siemens, the big engineering company, and General Electric, basically raising financing for projects. So I was doing that with my team, and we did projects, mostly big projects, some big, some huge, in Europe, but also in Africa and Latin America. And as it happens in Ukraine as well, where I was working for GE and helped raise the financing for a 100-megawatt wind farm that is in Zaporizhia and is in the occupied part of Zaporizhia now. And there's not much information on how that project is doing. I've asked around. But when I finished up with it, it was running and generating green electricity for Ukraine. So yeah, that's been my background, and been still carry on in different roles, doing this, as I said, as you noted, based in Munich, but working in different markets.
Is there a particular sphere of renewable energy that sort of you focused on, like in regards to like there's solar, there's wind, or like I don't know what nuclear.
Sure.
I don't know. This nuclear power doesn't really fit into that, but like what?
Yeah.
Yeah, like what? what aspect of is your
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, you've got solar, so photovoltaics. They can be small projects mounted on the just for the benefit of your listeners, your viewers, mounted on rooftops or in fields. You've also got another type of solar project that's not very well spread, or it's not widespread, but you have them in Asia, South America, called concentrated solar power, which is a bunch of mirrors that collect and concentrate the sun's power onto a boiler that raises the temperature of the boiler to steam levels and then powers a turbine. That's a different kind of solar power. And then wind, obviously, onshore wind farms. A lot of people have seen those, but there's also offshore wind, which is quite big in Europe and building up rapidly in China and to some extent in the US. And then there's hydropower, which is probably the original renewable power because hydropower plants have been around for 150 years. And in that space, and I guess this is also part of the renewable game, very new technology, are batteries, large scale batteries that are being used to basically store and manage electricity in the system. So I've tended to work on wind projects, onshore and offshore wind projects. I'm now increasingly working on battery projects because there's a lot of demand for batteries as you know, the big issue with renewable energy is it's intermittent. You only have electricity when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. And what do you do in the downtimes? Well, you store energy, and that's batteries are becoming a big part of that. And then I've worked on this concentrated solar power. I managed and developed a project in South Africa several years ago. But I think that technology is kind of on the wane because it's pretty expensive, and other renewable technology has become much cheaper and more competitive. So that's kind of been my area of focus.
let's jump right to Ukraine because you're fresh from a trip to Ukraine. So I'd
Yeah.
like you to talk more about why did you go there? What motivated you to go there? And what did you experience there?
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, I've done a few trips now to Ukraine during the full-scale invasion that kicked off in February 22, as I'm sure your listeners know. And you know, I think a lot of people were pretty shocked by what happened and what is happening. I guess maybe I was more shocked than most because I felt like I had to do something, and just seemed to me that this was just a completely wholly unjust war. And Ukraine and Ukrainians have been incredibly tough and resilient about this. And you definitely see that in the electricity sector. You know, I think it's important for people to understand um, that attacking the energy system in Ukraine is a key part of Russia's war effort. It's not like an accidental thing that, oops, we, you know, blew up a power plant. The Russians are deliberately targeting this stuff to undermine the Ukrainian economy, to make life very difficult for individual people, to literally leave people in the dark and in the cold and demoralize them. So this is part of a war effort. This is generally considered, as I understand it, maybe we need to look at this more closely. I understand this to be come under the definition of a war crime because you're blowing up civilian infrastructure that has no real military purpose. So, I was trying to figure out a way. I've been in, as I described, I've been in the energy sector for a long time. I've got a good network of people. And I was trying to think of ways to help out. And I've been working with a couple of guys I've known for a long time, and we put together an initiative called Re-Energize Ukraine, where we are looking around to get basically spare equipment, retired power equipment of all varieties, and I can go into some details if you want, to see if we can identify them, if they're still usable, if they meet the technical specifications, and get those delivered to Ukraine to be used for spare parts and to replace stuff that's been being hit by the Russians regularly. And we've been working mostly or dealing mostly with Ukraine's largest private energy company, DTEK, which is based in Kyiv, and they supply us with a list of critical things that they need, and we go out and try to find stuff. It's been challenging because for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of the stuff that was available at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, particularly the stuff in former Soviet systems, Soviet economies like Czech or Poland, has already been given to the Ukrainians because they were looking really for stuff that they could work with. And these systems, the power systems across Eastern Europe, were built under Soviet times. So it was kind of a no-brainer to get stuff to the Ukrainians that was extra because they could use that quickly. So a lot of the stuff that was available has already been given. The other thing is that the things that Ukraine needs, particularly in the transmission and distribution system of the power sector, are the kind of the things that everybody else needs right now. Because as we move to a greener electricity system, building out the grid, building out the distribution system, making it intelligent, building up transformers and substations, all these components, which I can tell you about later if you like. That's the stuff that everybody needs as our economies get greener in terms of electricity generation. So Ukraine is kind of competing with everybody else in that market. Now, separately, there are big government-to-government initiatives being run specifically by the EU, the Ministry of Energy in Ukraine, and USAID, the United States Aid Agency, which is pulled together a bunch of money, about €1 billion, to basically get find out from Ukrainian utilities, big and small. So some of the municipal companies from DTEK, from Ukrenergo, the big national utility, find out what they need, and then basically go out and put in public procurement programs to buy this material from manufacturers. So Siemens, GE, Schneider, Alstom, all these big companies are supplying Ukraine as well. So, but that's a commercial effort, takes a while. Our idea with Re-Energize Ukraine was to try to find stuff quick that didn't need to be bought, that could be donated and transported quickly. So that was my principal motivation to go to Ukraine this time, meet with people on the Ukrainian side, build up my network there, show people who I am, and live that I'm a energy professional. We're serious about this. We want to help people out because they don't know me from Adam, so to speak. And also to support, and you've interviewed him in the past, support some of the work that my brother Chris is doing with in the trenches and supporting some of the military units there, but trying to chip in basically where I can. And that was kind of a long-winded answer to your question, Dave. Sorry about that.
That's good. I wanted to get the long-winded answer because it's interesting. It's always interesting when there's an American who has no connection to Ukraine, but is investing their personal time, energy, and efforts towards trying to do something to help the situation there.
Sure. Yeah.
Why do you care? What's motivating you? I mean, to literally risk your life, but by going to Ukraine, where like the U.S. embassy is like, don't travel here, right?
Yeah. I guess I've been to Ukraine a couple times before. I worked on this wind project. I visited my brother when he was working in Kharkiv back in 2014-15 during the first part of the invasion. I guess probably I'm as you know, Damien, I'm kind of a transatlantic kid, US, European. My dad was a diplomat. I grew up in Europe, and I grew up very much in part of that world that, we're the West. This is the Western Alliance. We have shared values. We have a lot of cultural exchange. We share political systems, democratic political systems. And these are things to be valued. And for the longest time, I just thought, well, this is kind of just the state of the world. We've got this great setup with the EU, with NATO, with the Atlantic Alliance, all these things, this very rich set of interconnections between the US, North America, Europe, and some other Western countries. And obviously, the success of that model, I think, and the appeal of the model is clearly demonstrated by the fact that virtually all of the former East Bloc countries that were part of the Soviet sphere of influence have decided or wanted to join the EU, NATO, these other international organizations to bring them into this web of the Western, if you want, the collective West, I guess is the term that's used now. And Ukraine was one of those, right? And I believe that Ukraine, and some people dispute this, which I find remarkable, but I believe Ukraine is a sovereign nation. And by sovereign, it means a lot of things, but it also means the ability to choose your future and to choose the organizations that you want to be part of. And the fact that Ukrainians have chosen to become part of the European community and part of the West is what ignited the conflict in the first place. And you were there in person in 2014 in Maidan, which was clearly a decision by Ukraine to also lay down their lives to become part of this community. And I think, clearly Putin and the Russian leadership have decided they don't want that. And they want to basically, as it were, put the band back together, and try to recreate what they call the Ruski Mir. I just thought, well, that's just as the English would say, that's just not cricket. That's just not on, right? I mean, and so therefore, I kind of thought in my small way, I would try to chip in and help protect this community that has been built up since World War II that I think a lot of us took for granted and maybe still do, but is clearly under threat. And the most obvious form of that threat is what's happening in Ukraine.
So, in regards to Ukraine, their energy infrastructure has been attacked pretty relentlessly over the course of 3 years, and
Mhm.
I'm amazed that it's sort of like more or less things are still working. I mean,
Mhm.
how does it how does it work where they have to take out power for a certain amount of time during the day? I mean, how does the whole infrastructure of the grid and the system work? I mean, it seems to me like they've sustained so much damage, but yet, they're still able to manage it. Like
Yeah.
people aren't freezing, businesses are still operating. I mean,
Right.
how does that work? Like sort of like on a technical.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. It is pretty impressive. And I think people are pretty amazed. I mean, so just broad brush, I mean, um, you're right. The attacks have been relentless, and the Russian attacks on the power system have caused tens of billions of dollars of damage, right? So just some numbers, right? So about 70% of the thermal power plants. So Ukraine has historically four different types of power plants. Nukes, coal plants. So the nukes, before the full-scale invasion, nukes were providing about half of Ukraine's electricity, the nuclear power plants, four of them. Coal plants were providing about 22, 23%. Gas plants, about 9%. The rest, different things, some renewables, and oh, I shouldn't forget hydro. There's a lot of Ukraine has several hydro plants on the Dnipro and Dniester rivers. So one advantage, if you will, or upside, that the Soviet systems were kind of overbuilt, over a little bit, not necessarily over-engineered, but overbuilt. They built a lot of extra stuff so at some point, you could take out, lose power plants and wouldn't really hit the system that hard because they were kind of overbuilt in the first place. But just so your listeners know, so about 70% of the thermal power plants have been destroyed or damaged. So the capacity is not running, and DTEC and Ukrenergo are trying to replace and rebuild things as quickly as possible. In fact, recently they announced that they have taken an entire Lithuanian power plant and basically disassembling it and moving it to Ukraine to use it all for spare parts. So it's a big power plant. So it's kind of interesting. But the thermal power plants have been mostly destroyed. The nukes are still running, with the important exception of Zaporizhia, which is Europe's largest nuclear power plant, 5.8 gigawatts, gigantic. And the Russian military took that over in March of 2022, attacked it, which is total madness, but took it over and has forcibly required the Ukrainian staff to stay there and operate the plant. And the plant's not really operating at all right now, but they need to keep some of the systems running to keep it cool and stuff, but it's not generating any electricity for Ukraine or for occupied Zaporizhia. But the other three power plants, Rivne, southern Ukraine, which is in Mykolaiv, and there's another plant in western Ukraine, I can't remember the name. Those plants are still running and continue to provide the bulk of the electricity that Ukrainians are getting today. About half of the hydro plants have been destroyed or are non-operational. And of course, many people remember the attack, and you'll pronounce this better than I do, Damian, the Kharkova plant, the reservoir on the Dnipro that was bombed in 2023, completely destroyed the hydro plant and flooded a large swath of southern Ukraine. Huge damage. So I just want to lay some of that out to show that, as I said at the outset, destroying the power system is part of Russia's war plans, and on top of it, they've obviously destroyed substations. They've destroyed, Ukrainians get a lot of their heat in the cities from these combined heat and power plants, which send electricity and steam throughout the cities. They've destroyed boilers and other heating stations. So it's all a full-on attack. And what has been the result of that? So how have the Ukrainians managed? I can only tell you my observations. I'm sure there's people will be writing interesting reports about this. Oh, I should mention that the Ukrainians were planning to the electricity system was previously connected to Russia, and they had already been planning to disconnect from Russia. It's a program that had been running for several years, and they, oddly enough, they were doing a test disconnection from the Russian system 4 hours before the full-scale invasion began. So, like, literally, they disconnected from Russia. The invasion began, and their plans to reconnect to Russia, like 2 days later, were off the table, of course, following the war. The Ukrainians then put in an emergency request to connect into the European system. It's called ENSO, which is the connection of all, I think there's 37 European countries that are connected to one grid. And they had been working on that. That was part of the long-term plan, but they massively accelerated the program. And together with Moldova, they connected the European system in a matter of weeks, which would otherwise have taken probably a couple of years. And people consider this like an engineering marvel that this was pulled off. Huge effort by the Ukrainians, Moldovans, and European transmission companies to make all of this happen. Because all of it's, again, maybe a bit nerdy on my part, but just again, for the benefit of your listeners, synchronizing power systems is really complicated because basically all of the power plants are spinning at 50 cycles a second. So they're kind of like heartbeats. They're going at a certain level, and they all need to be brought together in unison. If there's any kind of divergence in the cycle and the frequency, it can throw the whole system off and create blackouts everywhere. So the Ukrainians had to it's kind of like coming up on your car on a highway at high speed and like jumping into the other car and taking over the driver's seat. That's kind of the way I think about it. So it's very tricky to do. But they pulled it off. They're now synchronized with the European system, and that's been important because Ukraine is importing about 2 gigawatts worth of power from the EU, mostly Poland and Romania, but also some from Slovakia. So, and that ties back to the gas pipeline story in a minute. But basically, huge destruction of the system, a lot of work to rebuild the power generation, particularly the thermal units. The Russians have not attacked the nuclear power plants because they know that would cause a meltdown and not be a good look, as it were, for Russia. Probably have huge damages for Russia as well. But they have tried to attack some of the substations that connect. So effectively, power comes out at a very high voltage from these power plants, and the voltage levels need to be dropped down so that ultimately they can be used by people like you and me. And that work is done by substations, transformers that change the voltage level. So rather than just attack the plants, they've tried to attack the substations. So the plants are unharmed, but they're unable to distribute the electricity they generate. And they do that all the time. And just to get to your question about how does DTEC and Ukrenago manage this? They have a very structured, I lived this when I was in Ukraine now in November and December. DTEC, which supplies Odessa and Kyiv and Dnipro regions of Ukraine, this utility, they have an app. You can look at it anytime. They'll tell you, hey, we have to shut down power in this part of the city for 4 hours, et cetera, and then it'll come back on. The whole time I was there, they were very punctual on drop-off times and restart times. Sometimes they brought power back on sooner. And during that time, they are basically working to repair the substation. So they'll shut down a substation that serves like northern Odessa, for example. Okay. And they'll do repairs there, get it back up and running. In the meantime, other people are getting their power. Then there needs to be work done on the substation damage. One of the other ones, they shut that down and so on. So they basically try to manage the maintenance program or the repair program so that the whole city is not affected at the same time. It's done piece by piece, and they're moving the engineering guys from one team back to another substation and fixing it that way. But they're always worried about another attack. The Russians have had no problem killing electricity workers. DTEC has lost something like 200 employees, most of them on the front fighting. But they've also lost several dozen of just guys, electricians doing their work on the system, and the Russians will come in with a missile and take out the substation and kill the guys. And it's just, it's unbelievably cruel. So as I said again, the idea is to make life difficult. I would say maybe just one other observation, and this, I think, from your own experience, walking around a Ukrainian town during a blackout, you hear nothing but power generators because everybody's bought these little diesel and gasoline things that they put out on the sidewalk so they can keep their bar, their cafe, their shop running, right? So you see them all over the place. People go there. Everyone tries to make sure that, before the scheduled power outage, your phone, your laptop is charged up. You've got your heat going so that if it's off for 3 or 4 hours, it doesn't get too cold. You do some of your shopping when you need to. So you just plan around it, right? But it is amazing. I mean, how fast people adjust. Even I was adjusting, saying, oh, well, I know that from noontime till 4 p.m, I won't have any power, so I better do these things in the morning or wait until the evening, right? And people just seem to adapt. I think it's been much harder on industry. Power demand from Ukrainian industry is probably down about 40% since before the full-scale invasion. So it's been tough. And those industries, that's damaged Ukraine's economy, even though the GDP has pretty much recovered from pre full scale invasion. It's been very tough on Ukrainian industry because some industry can move things around their production and their manufacturing around a schedule, but a lot of stuff needs power all the time, 24/7. And those facilities are being harmed by these attacks.
What's in the news now regarding the Ukraine energy is this gas pipeline that's still operating apparently through Ukraine, delivering gas to certain Eastern European countries. And I
Yeah,
guess Ukraine has been operating that because they've had a contract to do so that they, even though despite the war, they were fulfilling, but it's now expired. And Ukraine said it's
yeah.
not going to renew it. This is gas coming from Russia that's
Mhm.
going to Hungary, Slovakia, and maybe a couple other countries. And I don't know. Can you comment on you know how has that still been operating during the war, and what are the repercussions now that Ukraine has decided to not continue
Yeah.
servicing this gas in this way towards these countries? Like, what's the reaction there?
Sure. Yeah, so this is a pipeline. This is an old pipeline. I think became operational in the Soviet times in the 60s. It has this unwieldy name called Urengo Pomari Uzhgorod pipeline that runs from Siberia via the Kursk region, town of Sutsa, and which is now under control by the Ukrainians, then through Ukraine and goes to Slovakia, and from Slovakia the gas pipeline branches and goes to Czech and Austria. So uh, yeah, so the pipeline's been running for a long time. The Ukrainians had, I could be wrong on this. I think it was a 5-year contract that began before the full-scale invasion to supply gas. And it was initially designed to provide like pretty chunky amount of gas. Didn't really matter how much gas was moving through the pipeline. The Gazprom, the Russian gas company, had to pay the same amount to the Ukrainians. So it was a lot of gas. They pay the same amount as if it was a little bit of gas, right? So the Ukrainians have been making money on this to the tune of roughly €1 billion a year in fees. The gas being sold was worth about 6 billion to Gazprom, and the buyers were mostly Slovakia, Hungary, and a little bit the Austrians. And the basically the contract will run out in a matter of hours. It will run out. It'll expire on midnight today, so on the cusp of the new year. The Ukrainians have said they will turn off the pipeline at that point. The preparations are in place. Um, the uh, the amounts that are being delivered now are pretty small. They've fallen off quite a bit. The Slovaks, Hungarians have also diversified a little bit of their source. The Austrians are completely covered by other sources. Um, so what I'm reading now is that there won't be, in terms of supply, there won't be really any impact for these Central European countries that have been buying the gas. Um, they'll probably be paying more for their gas because they're going to buy it from other buyers around Europe and stuff, maybe some of the LNG that's coming in from Germany and stuff. But there won't be big price spikes. There won't be a loss of gas. You won't have Slovakians sitting around in the cold and all of this stuff. That doesn't seem to be in the cards at all. Nonetheless, as you know, Hungary and now Slovakia, Fico, the prime minister, have been much more Putin friendly, and have been putting a bunch of pressure on the Ukrainians to keep this flowing. The Ukrainians have offered up some solutions. They've said, for example, we would be able to use the pipeline. The Ukrainians are basically now self-sufficient in gas and probably getting close to being in a position to export gas. So it might be an opportunity to sell Ukrainian gas to these countries. The other alternative would be to buy gas from Azerbaijan that is also connected to the pipeline. Um, but there's been some issues that actually be Russian gas just with an Azerbaijan label on it. And the Ukrainians have said the Russians can continue to supply, provided they don't actually get paid until after the war. So the money would just accrue in a bank account somewhere. Um, and the Slovaks and Hungarians have pretty much turned those options down and made a big stink about it. The Slovaks have said, well, we're supplying some of your power out of this 2 gigawatts, 2,000 megawatts that Europe is supplying to them. Maybe we'll just cut that off. And so that's pretty shocking that an EU country would do that. The Poles have responded recently, said, well, if the Slovaks cut you off from their supply, we'll make it up for you from Poland. So it's, I'm sure I don't have the full story. I'm not in the room, Damien. I'm sure there's a lot of three-dimensional chess being played here. But clearly, the Ukrainians, everyone understands the Ukrainian position that this money that's being, this revenue from the sale of gas is being used to fund the war effort. So it'd just be madness for the Ukrainians to continue to, say, oh, that's fine with us, right? It will also be a hard hit for Gazprom. Gazprom went into losses for the first time since the 90s in 23. And this is just going to add to their loss position. So that's from the perspective of Ukraine and people who support Ukraine. That's a good thing because Gazprom is a big contributor to Russia's treasury and to their war effort, just in terms of taxes that they pay. So the fact that they're now running losses is a good thing as part of the counter economic war against Russia. So everybody fully expects that in a few hours that gas pipeline will be shut off, and people will have to figure out what they do after that.
Yeah.
I tell a lot of my German friends, they think I'm exaggerating. I said, listen, Putin is fundamentally after Europe. He wants to undermine Europe, and Ukraine is in the way, right? So that's, doesn't stop with Ukraine.
But they don't seem to perceive that direct threat from Russia. Like even though Russia has, meddled in the information sphere, undermined elections or manipulated things sort of through maybe what we call subversive or hybrid means.
Yeah.
They don't really see, I guess, Russia like as a direct threat to Europe, right? Even though the talk in Russia, if you pay attention to it, they talk, the commentators talk about bombing Berlin or bombing London and all this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean,
well, I think some people have pointed out. So I think you have to differentiate in Europe. Clearly, there are EU member states that are very switched on to this risk, right? Poland, Czech, the Baltics, the Nordics, and stuff. I think Germany, and this is probably maybe something that should be a separate podcast.
yeah,
You watch the German ambivalence about Russia that goes back to the war and goes back to policies that started in the 1970s about, the Ostpolitik. And, if we trade and interact with Russia, we can, build the relationships and, change through trade, was the concept. And I think, my sense, and this is just my opinion, but I think the Germans, when you have a mental model in your mind, right? Sometimes it takes a long time for the facts to kind of break through that model, right? And I think the Germans have built the last 40, 50 plus years based on a mental model of three things. One, the Germany can outsource its security to the United States, which is, frankly, the first duty of any government is to protect its nation. And the more you think about it, the more you think it's very strange that you would depend on your national security with a country that's 5,000 kilometers away from you. So that's one thing. Germany would always be protected by the United States through NATO. The other is that Germany would be able to basically develop friendly and productive relationships with Russia that would supply cheap energy to its industry and therefore allow it to be competitive vis-a-vis its European neighbors. And, the Russians, I had very senior people tell me 2 weeks before the full-scale invasion that the Russians would never turn off the tap to gas supplies to Germany because they needed German money too much. And I made a bet on that and I won the bet that they would, in fact, turn off the tap because it goes beyond economics for the Russians, for sure. And then the third thing is that China would always be a successful market for German exports, and that's changing as well. So I think, again, long-winded way of saying these mental models, these constructs that the Germans have are changing now. And the last 2 years has been a huge wake-up call for Germany. And I think it's taking time for them to get their heads around this. But as the Russians continue to engage their hybrid war, I mean, how many now? Three telecom fiber optic systems in the Baltic and the North Sea have been now torn up. I mean, this is highly unusual, and all the fingers point to some kind of Russian activity behind this. In addition to all the meddling in the political systems, et cetera. So I think it's just taking the Germans potentially longer than we would like to get rid of their old mental model and understand that we're not going back to the past. It's just never going to happen. It won't happen in our lifetimes for sure. And I think there are politicians in Germany who fully recognize that, but not everybody.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if the current governing SPD party is fully recognizing that,
No,
but I did want to ask you. We'll jump back to Ukraine, but while we're on the
sure,
topic of Germany,
sure.
um, they shut down all their nuclear reactors, uh,
Mhm.
in which case they've put themselves in a sort of a weaker position. And you've
Right.
mentioned that they're trying to evolve their liquefied natural gas facilities
Mhm.
to accommodate for the lack of gas that they're now not receiving from Russia. Why did they shut down their nuclear facilities, and why can't they just turn them back on and put
Mm.
themselves and become more less reliant on this gas from Russia that seems to be like such a critical part of their economy?
Yeah. Interestingly, it kind of goes back to Ukraine in some way, right? With Chernobyl. The Green Party, um, they had when they started forming in the 80s was it was obviously to promote a green economy and a green society, et cetera. But their big thing was shutting down the nukes. They felt that the nukes were too dangerous, that if there's a nuclear meltdown in Germany, that the country would be rendered uninhabitable, et cetera. And I think, I don't know this firsthand, but my sense is that they didn't really have much traction with this until Chernobyl happened, and there was a meltdown, and a massive radiation cloud swept over Germany and large parts of Europe, and that kind of supercharged and confirmed the Greens in their thinking that nukes were dangerous. And when they finally got so there was that. Then there was Fukushima in Japan in 2011, which was, I think a less, if I'm not mistaken, a much more contained meltdown. But when that happened, the German population was already kind of primed, and Angela Merkel at the time, basically, even though she was a CDU member, not Greens, and not in the government with the Green coalition, made the decision that the nukes would be phased out by 2022. I think it was the plan, and that was agreed by the German Parliament. Because they've just decided, well, we had Chernobyl, we had Fukushima, so it's all, we got to get out of this technology. That was basically the thinking. And then, of course, when the current government came in 2022, that was a key part of their program that we're going to have these nukes shut down. They were extended a little bit because of the Ukraine, because of the invasion, and they wanted to keep at least three of the nukes operating until Germany had time to replace the lost gas from Russia with other gas sources. But yeah, last year, the last of them went off the network. And there's been it's interesting. My understanding is that, in fact, a majority of Germans now think nukes aren't so bad and maybe we should be thinking about them and are not as vehemently opposed. I think there's even discussion in the Green Party about potentially introducing small modular reactors, a different type of nuclear technology that's being developed, and some small plants are being built. And the CDU and the CSU have pushed for reopening some of the ones that were recently shut down. The utilities say, hey, that's really complicated. This is not something, you just like flick a switch and turn these things back on. There's fuel reprocessing, there's all kinds of technical stuff that needs to be done. We've shut these things down now. You made us shut them down. You paid us to shut them down. We've kind of reconfigured our whole system planning and our investment program, and now you're changing your mind again, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a debate going on in Germany. But yeah, clearly shutting down the nukes has made Germany, in some respects, more vulnerable, and had other impacts. But it was ultimately a political decision. Maybe didn't have a whole lot of economic merit to doing that. But I know that's still a hot topic in Germany.
Yeah, and where does the liquefied natural gas fit in? You said that their facilities are not as evolved as they should have been at this point in time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so virtually every other European country, I think, with a coastline has the ability to, so you can move gas two different ways. You can move it by pipe, or you can liquefy it at a very cold temperature and put it in a ship, specially designed ship, and transport it. And then it comes into a port, and then the gas gets warmed up again, taken out of liquid form and turned back into gas, and then put into the pipe system. So you can do both. Moving gas around by pipe is a lot cheaper, and ergo, Germany's interest in having pipelines. In fact, the original pipelines that were built from the Soviet Union at the time to Germany were funded by the Germans in the late 70s and early 80s, though, to tap into the gas fields in Siberia. So it was a cheaper way to buy gas long term. And Germany never developed a port facility to buy liquefied natural gas. Even though, the Brits have like three at least, the Spanish have five, the French have a couple, the Dutch have a couple. So everybody's got them. And Germany had thought about it for a long time, even had sites selected and permitted to build these things, but they never did. And it's a mystery to me why they didn't build them, just to have backup, right? Because energy policy is about energy security, and energy security is about having diverse suppliers and diverse technologies. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Super important. And when Germany started building the pipelines to the Soviet Union, a lot of people were advising them not to do that, including the US government, saying you're taking geopolitical risk here. But they said, well, it won't be a big problem because we'll be diversified. We won't let any one country supply more than 25% of the gas that we need. So we'll get 25% from the Soviet Union at the time. We have our own production of gas in Germany at the time, 25%. We'll get some from the Dutch. They had big gas fields in the Netherlands, and we'll buy some from the Norwegians. The Norwegians have big offshore gas fields. So we'll be cool. And that was the thinking at the time. And that worked for a while. But over time, Germany's own production of gas domestically dropped off. The Dutch gas also dropped off, and it was causing a lot of damage to some villages and towns in eastern the Netherlands. So those fields were shut down, the big Groningen field, and then Germany started buying more gas from Russia to replace those volumes, to the point that shortly before the war, the full-scale invasion kicked off, about 60 to 65% of all of Germany's gas and crude oil was coming from pipelines from Russia. So they had developed a huge dependence on Russia, which you know, a lot of people were saying, look, this is not smart. But it was cheap, it was secure. The arguments were made that even in the depths of the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviets had never shut down the pipelines. We can depend on them. And then February 2022 changed all of that radically. I think it was a huge shock to Germany, when the whole premise of your world outlook is suddenly turned upside down. And a few days after the invasion, Scholz made his famous Zeitenwende, sea change speech in the German parliament and said, look, we're in a different world now. We have to rearm. We have to protect ourselves, and we need to do something about our gas dependence. And he then sent his Minister of Economy, his Vice Chancellor, Robert Habeck, on a mission during all of 22 to go out and buy gas, LNG from other countries and bring that to Germany to replace the lost volumes from Russia. And he ran around. He went, I think, I'm not fully in the details on all of this, but new contracts were signed with the US, I think with Qatar, possibly Nigeria as well. I'm not sure, but they were done at hyperspeed. I'm assuming, because everybody knew Germany was desperate, that probably the Germans didn't get a great deal on that. And then simultaneously, they had to build fast track port facilities to bring in this LNG because they had never had these port facilities from the past. So I think now 3 are operational. They're looking at a 4th. These are not land-based facilities. These are done through ships. They're so-called FSRUs, floating storage and regas units. It's a very elegant term, but basically these are ships that are located in the port, in the harbor, and they basically can take cargoes of LNG. And again, this isn't really my super area of expertise, but they can get cargoes of LNG and they can turn them back into gas on board and then connect through a pipeline into the system. So that's what the Germans have done. They were very fast about it. I think a lot of people were amazed that they were able to get these new contracts in place, with the consequence that Germany's gas supply situation now, 2.5 years after the start of the full-scale invasion and the loss of Russian gas, is pretty secure. Germany's gas storage levels are pretty good. They've got these contracts in place. They have benefited to some extent from a few warmish winters, which have put less pressure on gas demand because most gas is used in the wintertime. So that's where they are with gas. But and of course, the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, and I think I don't know anyone who's in the industry who seriously thinks that's going to be, they'll be buying Russian gas anytime soon.
Let's go back to Ukraine. I just
Mhm.
wanted to get your thoughts on looking at the future.
Mhm.
At some point, this sort of hot war will end in some way. There will be a Ukraine that needs to rebuild. What do you think that future looks like? I mean, will they move more towards like renewable energy or diversify their energy production? Will they be more working in tandem with the EU and Europe? I don't know. Do you have any sort of like from your like thoughts about that, or talking to people there during your trip about like what the future of the Ukrainian energy industry could look like after the
Yeah.
war?
Yeah. So I think, I've had a number of conversations about that. I think Ukraine will, in many respects, change their electricity system. I think there are kind of 3 elements of that. One is it will be greener for sure. Ukraine has good renewable resources, a lot of sun, a lot of wind. Hydro again can be rebuilt, so there's plenty of scope for really pushing out more green power generation in Ukraine, and I think that will happen. I mean, you do see wind farms around Ukraine already, and a lot of people have bought solar panels already, just as not because they want to be green, but because they want to have electricity in their house, right? So you see people just putting these things up on their roofs, particularly out in the villages and stuff. But in any event, I think there will be a concerted effort to make Ukraine's system greener. Um, I think the other thing will be it will be more decentralized. So they won't, I mean, the nukes will stay the nukes, but there won't be, my sense is there will be much more, instead of rebuilding coal plants, they'll build smaller gas-fired power plants, et cetera, that will be sprinkled around the country. So to have fewer big targets in the future if the Russians decide to come back, right? So they'll have a more decentralized system. And I think they want to build a more resilient one. So things will be reinforced. There'll be more stuff underground. There's things you can do with software technology that allows the systems to be more resilient and have more redundancy and capability in them to respond to emergency situations. And I should probably add, I think it will be more integrated with Europe. So the connections to Europe, to the European power system will intensify. Ukraine has a lot of gas storage capability that they could offer Europe. These are, secure underground reservoirs that are 3 kilometers underground, very safe, pipeline connected into Central Europe. So that will be part of it as well. So yeah, I think, and you talk to folks, and not to be, you know, I don't know if it's morbid is the right term. I always feel a little bit odd about, people making money out of a war, even though obviously I'm not naive, people do. But I think a lot of people are kind of excited, if you will, about the opportunity to, to use the term build back better, right? To build the system and make it greener, more resilient, more decentralized, and more part of Europe, and ideally get the Russians to pay for it, with some of these frozen assets.
Do you, I've seen some commentators mentioning that one of Russia's incentives to take this territory of Ukraine is because of the potential to harness energy resources there.
Mhm.
Is that still, I mean, that area is known for coal
Right,
energy, which is sort of like an outdated technology. Is there
right.
is there other energy resources that are there, like whether in the Black Sea or in the, Donbass or eastern part of the Ukraine that are still untapped? Like, and is that part of like Russia's like incentive to keep, I don't know, losing so many Russian lives there, or is that not really a big factor?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what you're hearing. I wonder, like, first of all, like, even if Russia were to succeed in ultimately incorporating the occupied or parts of the occupied areas into Ukraine, from Ukraine into Russia, right? What are they going to do with them? I mean, where do they have the money to rebuild? What are they going to rebuild? These places have been depopulated, much of them. Most people have been to Ukraine. Some people have even gone to Russia. The industries are clapped out. What's the plan? I personally don't see it. And I wonder really what will happen there. I think I could imagine these areas just becoming you know, kind of wastelands over time, which would be a tragedy. But I don't think Russia has an economic plan for these places, any real economic plan for these places. There are other resources in Ukraine, further west, in rare earth. So a lot of the minerals needed for the energy transition, the lithium, the cadmium, the nickel, the copper, et cetera, that is really untapped, and that would be a huge economic benefit of Ukraine in the future, because those are the minerals that are needed for the energy transition. And Europe, particularly, is very dependent right now on China for a lot of that stuff, and for their own geopolitical reasons, would much prefer having, a friendly neighbor supplying those things in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know we can keep digging into different topics
Sure.
here, but we kind of have to wrap something up. Is there something that we
Yeah.
haven't touched on that I don't know, you'd like to share your thoughts on or comment on? Is there anything that, you feel like this is important we haven't covered?
Um, I think I think obviously the real test is what's happening now going through this winter, because particularly if it's a colder winter than the last couple ones, the power system is much more, I think probably more, despite all the amazing work, and it really is epic work that the Ukrainian engineers and system operators have done. These guys are all heroes in my view. The system is more fragile. I mean, it's just harder to keep taking these hits. The Ukrainians have shown amazing resilience and creativity on these things. And, I think they will continue to need Europe's help. And I hope that, the formal government programs still continue to get funding, and initiatives like our own Re-Energize Ukraine, that we can find people who will help support us with spare equipment so that we can continue to help fight the good fight. But I've been seriously impressed by Ukraine and what the Ukrainians have done. So I hope they carry on.
За свободу свою ставай до бою, за свою неземну ставай до бою, всі молитви тобі, ставай до бою, брами неба озвуться громом.